Hello everyone, this is Adam Holland here, and I have the pleasure of being interviewed by Toronto's Root. Somebody on the Ex-Scientologist message board had some very good questions, and I had a bit of difficulty sitting down to write out all the answers, so I thought the best thing to do would be to come out, get a chance to meet Toronto's Root again, say hi, and we'll just do a video interview so that I can get the questions answered and everyone gets to see my beautiful face. Alright, two things. Well, actually the first thing was, so this is the purpose of this is to just get it off my mind, because I'm like kind of disorganized, I've been really busy with stuff. And the other thing is, I've seen so much stuff out there with the TV series and all of the videos being done by other former members, and so I'm going to try and focus not on what's already been covered, but to try and focus on some of the things that I noticed were not necessarily touched on or not touched on in great detail in a lot of the other footage and interviews and television shows that have already aired. So, Toronto's Root, without further ado.
Do you know what originally prompted your family to become interested in Scientology?
Yes, I do. On one side, my mom, her brother is Peter Byrne, who, as far as I know, is still one of the executive directors of either Vancouver Day or Vancouver Foundation. They have like it broken up into two organizations. And he got into Dianetics very early on and kind of dragged her with him. And so she didn't really want to be a Scientologist, but she kind of just, because of being spending so much time with her brother, she kind of got, forcefully brought into it, and eventually just started to go with the flow and started to believe in it. And then on my dad's side, I know that he was in Ottawa, and I think he told me that he was feeling a little bit down, a little bit depressed, and a staff member from the Ottawa Church of Scientology came up to him. They must have been walking up and down the street, and asked him if he needed, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said something along the lines of, do you want to improve your life, or whatever they say, and brought him in. And my dad really started to fall in love with it very quickly. And then from Ottawa, on my dad's side, he came down to Toronto, and my mom ended up in Toronto as well, and they actually met in the Toronto Church of Scientology, and they got married. So
Wow.
yeah, so yeah, I was born to two Scientology parents in Toronto, and like I said, my dad was looking for a bit of help with I think it was depression and a lack of motivation about work, and my mom just kind of got dragged into it, unfortunately.
Oh, that is sad. If only he didn't get caught into it and he went to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health or something. That would have got him into the better direction.
True, but if they hadn't met in Scientology, I wouldn't exist, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to say about that.
Yeah, it's one of the strangest things that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Next question.
Yeah.
You wrote that you have a sister. Was she also involved in the church?
No. Fortunately, after my mom and dad divorced, my mom was no longer that interested, because like I said from the very beginning, it wasn't appealing to her. She was just kind of brought along into it. So my sister was never involved in Scientology, and I'm glad. She's doing well, so.
It's good to know.
Yeah.
Are you still in touch with her?
Yep. Yeah, so because she was never in Scientology, she was never ordered to disconnect from me when I got the declare. So, we talk on the phone now and then, but she doesn't want to be, involved in the after effects of me being in Scientology, but I respect that, and like I said, she's doing well because she's never been involved, but she is supportive, so I'm glad for that.
That's good to know. Given that you were young when you joined and began living at the Toronto building, did you partake in courses that were a financial burden?
Alright, well, one of the reasons that I consider myself lucky is that I didn't actually get involved, even as what they call a public, in Scientology until I was almost 18 years old. And the reason was because after my parents divorced, they both got what's called a PTS declare, which means that they have to make amends and do ethics conditions and stuff. So my dad was not really involved with the Church of Scientology. He was just trying to make amends for many, many years. And as a result of that, I was not immersed in Scientology culture because I never actually went to the building. I only grew up with what my dad was telling me, and he was teaching me the theory and the theology of Scientology. And I think that's one of the reasons why I may not have been as deeply brainwashed as someone who was involved with the culture and was going into the building every weekend or every day. So that is a good thing. Now, when I did start was actually the first course I ever did in Scientology, apart from what my dad had done with me at home, teaching me as he was raising me, it was actually a birthday present for my 18th birthday. It was the basic study manual, and it wasn't that really, it wasn't a very high level course. And of course it was a birthday present, so he paid for it. And very shortly after that, I actually was recruited into the Sea Org. And in the Sea Org, because you live there, you eat there, you sleep there, there's not really any time to have a day job. So they don't charge you for any of the courses that you take or the auditing that you receive while you're in the Sea Org.
If you did study courses, did you ever attain any of the OT levels?
The courses that I took, apart from the basic study manual as a public, after I was recruited into the Sea Org, it was all courses mostly oriented towards this is your job, this is how to do your job. So they often speak in the Scientology organization as there are two sort of sides to the bridge to freedom. One side is the spiritual counseling therapy side, and the other side is called the technical side. So either the technical work of doing your job or the technical work of becoming what's called a Scientology auditor. In other words, the Scientology counselor who does the auditing, does the spiritual therapy. So I never really moved up the spiritual side of the bridge. I was quite, down at the bottom. And the interesting thing is that most of the people in the Sea Org, where I was in CLO Canada, were also quite low on the bridge, and that's very interesting. So they're all there with this aspiration or hope of getting to these, miraculous and amazing OT levels, but none of them actually were there, which is interesting. So there weren't too many OTs in the Sea Org.
Okay. Was there a certain point in time where what you learned from the teachings seemed so outlandish that it made it hard for you to believe, i.e. the much referenced OT3 stories?
No. Because I was brought up from a very young age, I remember being told some of the interesting, spiritual stories about what happens and how in Scientology they say you're a spirit who's millions and billions of years old and have had many lives before. I mean, if I'm learning that from as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, then if you already have that view, it's actually called a paradigm, where you see the world as an entirely different frame than what most people see the world as, then there's not very much that's going to be strange or weird because of the initial concept that I was raised with. And so I never found out about the OT3 story until actually after I left the Sea Org and started researching what had happened. How did I get involved in this, and what's the truth about it? So I was very much a believer, and you wouldn't have been able to say very much that would have been strange to me. I would be like, yeah, I know, it's...
Wow. Even about Xenu and that.
Yeah. I'll talk about that later, but yeah. The story about Xenu, it's not like I hear that and go, whoa, that's strange. It's just okay, that's probably happened, I guess, along with all the other strange things that happened in the past trillions of years, right? Okay.
Okay, so next one. Were you audited frequently? Do you feel like they tried to trap you into saying incriminating things that could later be used against you?
Well, there's two things about that. The first thing about the question is, the word audited is actually only used for the spiritual counseling or therapy part of Scientology. So even though if you're looking from an outside view, you see a guy, he's holding the cans and somebody's talking to him on the e-meter. There's two very different uses. And when it's auditing, it's supposed to be a positive experience. You may go into, I guess, negative events in the past, in hopefully this life, or, you know, what people think is previous lives, but that's not where the incriminating things come from. There's actually a term called sec checking, which stands for security checking, and it's to make sure that the person is not connected to an enemy of Scientology, or won't become an enemy of Scientology, or is not already an enemy of Scientology in disguise. So it's actually in sec checking, and the first thing that the person says to you when you sit down at the desk and you're holding the cans is they say, "I am not auditing you." And that's like, this is business. This isn't just to make you feel better. We want to answer, we want questions. We have questions and we want answers to those questions. So in sec checking, yeah, definitely. I mean, when a Scientologist sits down for a sec check, they are told that the purpose is, you know, to protect everybody and everything. There's never any hint or concern that maybe this is to get revenge at some point. But I mean, even before a sec check, one of the first things I had to do after signing up for the Sea Org is I had to fill out a really long form. We're talking 10, 20 pages of questions. It was called the Life History Form. And you typed it up on a computer using Scientology software. It looks like really old software from the days before Windows, like MS-DOS, if anybody knows what that is. And then it gets printed out and it's stored in your ethics folder, which is also an important thing, is that if you've heard or read anything about Scientology keeping the contents of auditing as priest-penitent confidential material, that's the auditing folder. That's the folder that they accumulate while they're doing the therapy, the fun stuff, like helping you feel better. But the sec checks, the security checks, the interviews, the ethics stuff, and that life history, that goes into the ethics folder. And I have no doubt that if there was anything particularly bad in there, if they decided to make a website about me or produce any kind of material against me, that they'd dive in there and say whatever they could say. And if there wasn't anything there, they'd just make it up. So that's well known. But yeah, so it's the sec checks where they get the information that they can use against you. I didn't get any auditing, and most Sea Org members did not, because you have to be upstat, you have to be doing a great job, you have to have no current ethics conditions. And the funny thing is by nature of the policy is the lower the statistics are of the whole organization, the more pressure there is on the ethics officer to put everybody into lower ethics, because the policy says if the conditions of the whole organization are down, you got to find out who's the troublemaker. So by nature of being down stat a lot of the time, by having statistics low all the time, at least as it was at CLO Canada, very few people even had the opportunity to do auditing. So I think I know one person in the entire CLO Canada that actually did even 12 and a half hours of auditing session. Other than that, nobody else did it. It was all sec checking. So that's
12 and a half hours.
Well, not constantly 12 and a half. It's
Okay.
it's broken up into, for auditing, it's broken up by a win. So you go until the person has a moment where they have some sort of realization. They suddenly feel really great. They figure something else. They figure something out about their past, or about problems they've been having in the present or in their recent life, and they say, you know, I feel really good about that. And then they say, okay, we'll stop now. So it could be as short as half an hour. It could be an hour and a half. The 12 and a half hours are just some strange billing idea that Mr. Hubbard came up with. So it's like you as a public member paying for it, you'd pay 12 and a half hours at a time. But it would be broken up into short sessions that would end each time you had I think it's called a cognition. Yeah, when you have a cognition, when you have a win, you feel good, they cut that off, they stop there, and then you come in next week or whenever you do. All right, next section of the interview is in the Sea Org, the moment where I committed to 1 billion years in service of the people of Earth.
Okay. 1 billion years is a really, really long time.
I know, I left like 999 million years early.
Okay. This may probably be a given, but I'll ask anyway. Were you required to sign the 1 billion year contract?
Yes. Now, even after you sign it, it is acknowledged in the circles of the Sea Org that it's more symbolic than an actual contract. After I signed that, they have a typical staff contract that's either 2.5 or 5 years. So that's the one where you're actually legally bound to be a staff member. even though they say Sea Org members are volunteers. So I did sign a 5-year staff contract. But the interesting thing about the billion-year contract is that it really solidifies that sort of glare in your eyes that you're really dedicating yourself to Scientology and nothing else. And in that respect, it's actually a bigger part of mind control than it is about contractual obligations. It really put me in that state of mind that I was ready to let go of everything in my life and just focus on this, because as being raised a Scientologist, you get to the point of believing that it's the only thing that can save not only this planet but this sector of the galaxy. So it was a big part of the initial component of the mind control that was used to make me, a very dedicated servant of the Sea Org. Mm-hmm.
Okay. In an online post, you mentioned nightly stops at the convenience stores when in the Sea Org. Was this essentially limited free time that you had to yourself, or were you required to pick things up for others?
It was the only free time. Walking to and from the communal housing, also called the berthing, it was the only time where you could put on headphones and listen to some music or pick up a snack. The interesting thing is that at CLO Canada, people got to walk usually by themselves. There was not, it was pretty relaxed in that respect, as long as you showed up on time for the morning muster, which is like everybody stands up and they go to attention, like in the military thing, military formations, and as long as you're on time for that, they don't even care if you miss breakfast. So when I did go down to Los Angeles, which is one level up in management, called ILO, International Liaison Office, I actually found out that when I went by myself to a convenience store, I got in trouble. Somebody gave me a big warning, like, oh, you're not supposed to go by yourself, you could be kidnapped by an enemy of Scientology. And now I look back on that and I just realized it was part of trying to keep people under control. Nobody's going to kidnap somebody just because they're in the Sea Org. But they said that it was dangerous. They tried to scare people. And in fact, the next day after I did go to that convenience store by myself, they put all kinds of signs all around the first floor of the building, the Hollywood Guarantee building, saying like, policy is you must go with at least one other person and blah, 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 blah. So yeah, in CLO Canada, it was a little bit more relaxed, but I tend to find that that's how it is in the Sea Org, the higher up you go, closer to the core management, the more strict things get. But down at the level of the CLO at CLO Canada, yeah, we generally were not too strictly regimented in times like going home for the night or coming in for the morning.
Were you allowed to leave unescorted?
That's an interesting question. When people think about or hear the word, like when I will tell people that I escape Scientology or that it requires an escape, and then at the same time you could look and see examples where I would walk home by myself at night and walk back there in the morning, and you'd say, well, why didn't you run? And the answer is that the trap is in your head, right? As long as you think that this is the most important thing in the world, and as long as you believe that it's the most important job that you could do to help other people, you're not gonna leave. People only start to want to leave once they realize that it's not everything that it's not everything that they thought it was, and they start to see some things wrong. So in the case of CLO Canada, where there's no fencing, there's no locks to keep people in, I was able to travel around unescorted, and it's only when you escape in your mind, when you go, you know what, I think that this has been a kind of a mind trick and I don't think I really want to be part of this anymore. That's when it's time to start to go. The only time I've seen people being escorted is if they were doing a lower condition, or they got in trouble for something or removed from their job because they did something wrong, and then I guess they're just worried about them leaving because they're like embarrassed about getting caught, or they feel guilty about getting caught for not doing a good job. But apart from people doing lower conditions, or people who are involved with having to do some sort of amends for ethics, there was a lot of freedom in terms of where we could walk and where we'd go. Like during my job, during our business hours, the 18 hours in the day, I would go to like a post office and buy some stamps, or send something, like, and nobody had to go with me. But again, in my head, I was a complete servant of them because of everything that I had been raised by, everything that my dad had taught me, and everything that I had come to believe about how important Scientology was and how vital my role was in saving the world. So.
Were you paid for being in the Sea Org at all?
Sea Org members are paid. The maximum for a regular Sea Org member is $50 a week. And then the maximum for somebody who's in the level above that, which is called CMO, Commodore's Messengers, and they're supposed to be the really serious, like, they speak for L. Ron Hubbard directly, and when they speak to you, you must do what they say, and there's no talking back. They make $100 a week, but still, $50 a week, $100 a week. At 100 hours a week, they're making $1 an hour. We're making 50 cents an hour, so it's nothing. I do have tax documents that actually were part of what I submitted to Orangeville Banner and Toronto Star so that they could validate my story. So I think for the whole year of 2008, because that was the only year that I was there for a full 12 months. I was only in for like 9 months in 2007 and 3 months in 2009. So 2008, I made about 4,000 something for all the years, all the hours that I had been working. And I once did a calculation at minimum wage, and at 100 hours a week for 52 weeks, I mean, you know, we're talking six figures even at minimum wage. But yeah, I made an actual amount of 4,000 something.
Wow, doesn't that actually...
That doesn't include overtime and anything.
Doesn't that break the labor laws?
It does, but that's why they say that we're volunteers, and nobody in the Sea Org is complaining because they don't even care about money. That's part of, when you're signing that billion-year contract, you're going like, you know, you've gone all spiritual at that point. You are ready to forgo all of the ins and outs of daily life. Owning a house, owning vehicles, owning property, having bank accounts, all of that stuff. It's kind of it's comparable in a way to I think it is a Buddhist or similar to a belief system similar to Buddhism, where they abandon all wealth and they just decide to be poor in order to pursue the spiritual aspects of their beliefs. So in the Sea Org, it's like that. You're abandoning everything, and it's not like, didn't matter to me if I made $50 a week or if I made $5 a week. I mean, sometimes we actually did make $15 when the CLO was doing poorly and not making very much money. But at the end of the day, you know, there was at least food to eat, and I felt, for most part of it, that I was under the illusion that I'm helping to save the world. So, you know, that was what I was thinking about. I wasn't thinking about how much per hour I was making. You know, you're totally like in another world almost.
Okay. Do the leaders in Canada, from what you have witnessed, tend to live a wealthy life thanks to Scientology?
Well, as I've previously said, wealth is not a thing for at least the Sea Org members that I was aware of, and the highest ranking person that I'm aware of in the CLO would be the commanding officer of CMO, so it's the one level up, the $100 a week, and I'm pretty sure that she only made $100 a week, same as everyone else. The only luxury I was aware of, because I was helping move one berthing to another berthing, is I was helping to move some furniture for the CMO portion of the berthing, which is separate from everybody else. Everybody else had either male-female rooms or couples rooms. And the CMO got our own room with, you know, a small bed, and the rest of the CMO were in bunk beds. So, I mean, if there's any luxury, that's about it. Now, after I left, I did receive some messages from people who were not former members, but just researching Scientology in Canada. And what I do know is that there are some interesting addresses that didn't seem to be, like, no Sea Org members seemed to be privy to them. One of them I tracked down was actually IASA, which is the International Association of Scientologist Administrations. And so they had a separate building, and it's weird that even though I was pretty deep into the Sea Org, I never knew that separate building existed. And I'm not sure why nobody knew about that building. Also, another thing that somebody told me online after I left is that there's another building that they somehow connected to Scientology, and the name is not recognizable. The staff members who are in charge of the office are not recognizable, but they somehow linked it And that there may be, and I'm willing to accept that there may be some sort of extra layer of secrecy going on that not even Sea Org or CMO knew about. And if anybody was rich, it may have been people operating those offices, whatever they were. But as the majority of Sea Org members in Canada, the U.S., and the world go, nobody's rich. Nobody's making tons of money. It's all a very stoic kind of lifestyle where you're giving up your life because you believe in something.
You wrote that you worked doing security during some of the protests. Looking back, were there any requirements of the job that seem odd to you now?
Yes, the great launch of the attack of Anonymous. Now, I'm not saying attack because you actually attacked Anonymous. It's because they wanted us to believe that you were attacking. From the get-go, it was very interesting looking back. From the get-go, as soon as people in Scientology, I guess in the upper levels, as in down in international management in California, as soon as they found out, messages went down to all the organizations in the world. It was it was really a very alarming situation from the insider perspective. And let me just check my notes here. Okay, so the first thing is they went to DEFCON 2. We had a big meeting. The COOSA, Yvette Shank, was the chair of that meeting, and the purpose was to brief us on this big threat to both the CLO staff and the Church of Scientology Toronto downstairs. And they were covering all kinds of, I think they specifically just went looking for every random comment that sounded threatening, like Yvette said that there was plans to bomb the toilets with something to make them overflow. That never happened, and I don't think there was any plans for that to happen, but maybe she found it, or somebody found something somewhere, and they picked it up because it served the purpose of making the protesters seem like an enemy, like they're threatening. Not that what they were actually doing, which was just trying to educate people that there's something going on here, but by bringing up our defenses and telling us that they're an enemy, they were trying to basically reduce the chances that anyone would pay attention to what they really had to say. So they were really putting a lot of effort into protecting us from reading any of the protest signs or possibly believing what any of the protesters had to say. So they gave people jobs. They also said during the time of the protests, before and after, they said nobody goes home alone. They're beefing up their personal security measures. Everybody has to go home in groups of 3 or more, come back in groups of 3 or more. And one of those people has to have a phone to call 911. Again, nothing ever happened and nothing was going to happen, but by scaring us, they were preventing us from opening our eyes and seeing that these people just want to help us, which, again, very interesting and very well prepared. And my job was to stand security. I was actually taken off my job for a couple weeks, and I was sitting down at the desk at the ground floor of 696 Yonge Street there, and I was watching out basically for any of these, purported vandals, this purported vandalism that Anonymous was going to do. I was supposed to write down notes if Anonymous, if any people with the Anonymous masks, I guess, because that's what they were wearing, if they showed up, and I was like, oh, Anonymous! So I got to write that down. And there wasn't too much. There was photography going on, but I wasn't given a camera, so it was other staff who were helping me, and some of them, like, if you know the building, like there's the main entrance is sort of far away from the corner, so I could only see really out the main entrance, but there would be a second person sometimes over on the other side behind those one-way blinds, and you couldn't see them because they were one-way blinds. So standing outside, it would just look like everything was shuttered. But there's actually occasionally a guy standing there or sitting there with a camera ready to take a picture if somebody were to try and, say, damage or smash the windows or do anything to the property. So it was very high alert. I do remember seeing a video, I think it was of you, Toronto's route, and the police car shows up and they tell you to take off your mask. Do you remember that?
Oh yes, I.
Okay, so the
totally
lady
remember
who
that.
photographed you, she was the commanding officer of CMO Canada. So you should feel pretty proud. You were that important that the top person in Canada had to come down and personally make sure they got your photo. So
And
you were a very important target.
I definitely made sure I had my back turned when they took the photos, so they didn't see my face at all.
Yeah, but the
I
fact
wouldn't
that
have
she was
cared
taking
anyway.
time out of her day, that's like the premier of Ontario coming down to take your photograph. Like you became very high priority, so you should feel proud about that.
She got the mask.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I didn't even know those blinds were one way. I thought they were like solid.
Yep, they're one-way blinds with the specific purpose of being able to catch people who think they're going to get away with a crime so that they can get busted.
Ah.
So clever, very clever.
So I thought they couldn't. So we had our signs up against the window at one point before they called the police, and we did it 3 times in a row.
Yeah. So the problem with that is if they don't
They
want their
saw the
members to read.
signs.
Yeah, they saw the signs exactly. So they were trying to protect their members from reading what you guys had to say.
Wow, that was fun.
There was 2 things I will add about my job on security that are kind of interesting. One thing is they goofed up their phone call alertness, and what happened is the phone system for the Toronto Church of Scientology was a 14 lines.
That's a lot.
Yep, or at least there was 14 buttons on the phone.
Oh.
I don't know how many lines they actually had. But what happened is our orders, or my orders were that anytime we got a call, and there was a lot of prank calls happening for at least a week or so, anytime we got a prank call, we were supposed to pick up the phone and dial, there was a special number, it's not *69, which just gives you the phone number, it's a 5-digit number, and it doesn't give you the phone number, it sends the details of the call to the nearest police station, and it can incur a $5 charge every time. So you get 10 phone calls, that's $50 of billing. But the sad thing is that nobody realized except for me. I'm pretty sure I was the only one who realized this, that what the pranksters were using is, I'm pretty sure it was Skype. They were calling via the internet. And whenever the call came in through the internet, it came on line 14. Always. And I don't know why, but that's what happened. It came on line 14, and there was this really strange phone number. It wasn't like a 416, it was like a 0000000 and then some other numbers. But then if you pick up the phone after you hung up, you were on line 1. And you press that 5-digit number and you'd send the thing to the police. Now the funny thing is there was 2 harassing calls we were getting. One was from Anonymous and another was from Flag. Flag being the flag service organization in Ottawa. And they were calling the Toronto Church of Scientology because they wanted some report, or they wanted somebody to get reg to go down there and for a course. And between the 2, actually, the calls from Flag were more harassing than the Anonymous calls. So the Anonymous calls, you just hang up. The Flag calls, you got to explain, sir, the org is closed, I'm just from the Sea Org upstairs, they're gone home, nobody's here, there's nothing I can do. And they'd be like, no, you have to go get someone right now, go home, wake them up. And I'm like, sorry, I'm not going to go back to the berthing and wake up the so-and-so because you want them to report back on whether or not this public is going to Flag. I'm sorry, you'll have to talk to them tomorrow. So that was harassing. But the funny thing is they were the ones calling on line 1. So whenever me or any other security guard for that time would pick up and send the number to the police station, we were actually sending the phone numbers for Flag Service Organization, Advanced Organization LA, what else? The International Liaison Office. You know, all these management organizations, all these Scientology organizations were being sent to the police station.
Oh, no.
And not a single one of the anonymous calls went to the police because as soon as I did try the line 14, it said, I'm sorry, we cannot process this call because it's from the internet. So I don't know how much money they wasted on that procedure, but that was a total fail on their part. The one thing that I did that was actually my own idea, nobody told me to do this, I was just, I'm like, sitting all night, it's pretty boring, and we did have an event and we got a delivery of like 20 party pizzas from Anonymous that we had to turn away, and so I was like, well, that's kind of a piss off. Again, most of the stuff that happened was not actually anonymous protesters, it was just people that were troublemakers already. Like, for example, the worst thing that actually happened to the org during the anonymous protest was some guys that didn't look very good anyways. They looked like they were troublemakers. They threw some eggs at the windows. It kind of sucked because it was February, so the eggs froze, and that was kind of painful trying to get them cleaned off. But Anonymous themselves did not do anything to the building. And so, and again, I don't know who ordered those pizzas. They smelled good, but we weren't, they were expensive, so we had to send them back. I actually did a counterintelligence, and I called every pizza place on a Friday night between like 8 and 9 o'clock. I called every pizza place in the phone book and told them not to send us pizza if there was an order. And the smaller guys, like the small non-franchise pizza places, it actually did a bit of a good job in terms of public relations. They were really glad that I called and let them know, because it cost them more money than like the big places. The big places, you couldn't even call the local restaurant. They said, you know what, if we get an order, we'll send it. We can't waste time, like, filtering through the prank calls. So I did my best,
man.
but that was my little piece of work on trying to keep the pranks to a minimum. Other than that, it was really boring, not much to do, and there was never any actual anonymous attack. The toilets were fine. No, nothing happened with the toilets. So, but it did work in terms of, we really were conditioned to think that these guys are the enemies. Don't pay attention to them. Don't read their signs. That was the number one thing for the time period of the protests. Okay.
Next question. Were you being requested to take photos of protesters or anything?
I kind of jumped the gun on that one. Yes. The next question is about taking photographs of protests. There were definitely people taking photographs, and there's actually a department of Scientology, both at the public level in terms of the Scientology organizations that you see, like Toronto Church of Scientology, and then there is also a parallel division higher up in the Sea Org called the Office of Special Affairs, and their job is to deal with enemies or perceived enemies of Scientology. And so they were definitely interested in getting photographs, but because I was not part of OSA, I was just doing a temporary job, which is security. It wasn't my job to collect information on the protesters, but they were definitely doing a lot to collect information. They had some, they're always trying to link it back to the psychiatrists, right? The psychiatrists are the mastermind behind every attack on Scientology. So they were trying their best to link it back to psychiatry, and I don't think they succeeded, because obviously it had nothing to do with psychiatry. But for example, one of the things that they did gather is one day we went out handing out these flyers, and I wish I had a copy, and maybe somebody out there has a copy, but it was actually what they call a black PR, or black public relations flyer, with some quotes from, I guess, 4chan that were trying to make Anonymous look bad. And I think it was around the time that some people from Anonymous were handing out flyers about the truth about Scientology. And that was an interesting day, because the reaction from the general public were like, there's these guys wearing silly masks here, and there's Scientologists handing out flyers here. They're both handing out flyers, and they're just like, they didn't want it. And one guy even yelled at me. He's like, you guys are just goofing around. Like, you're just doing the same thing to each other. Like, it was a weird experience. But yeah, so an OSA's job, the Office of Special Affairs, was definitely interested in collecting information, but it wasn't my job because I wasn't in that division.
You've also mentioned several things as having saved you from the Sea Org. You referenced the young girl that you said inadvertently saved you. You also mentioned the sales-focused culture. You were not able to visit your family without permission. What would you say the primary influence to make you leave? Was the primary influence to make you leave?
This is a long question. And I will say it right out. I don't think that it is simple enough that there's just one answer to what made me leave. I said before that compared to people who I know, especially people who joined and went right up to CMO, which is the sort of the most serious-minded, like dedicated of all Sea Org members, that because I wasn't involved, I wasn't attending church services, I wasn't doing courses from a young age, I was kind of given more of a real world view on life, so to speak. But I would say that, there's a little bit of everything that kind of filtered into that. Actually, one thing I didn't get to mention from the security job was I still continued a bit of a vestige of my security duty, which is on Sunday nights, nobody from the Toronto building, nobody from the Toronto Church of Scientology wanted to stay on Sunday nights because they had work the next morning. So I only did Sunday nights, no other day of the week. I would cover half the night, and somebody else would take the other half, so that we could at least have half the Monday. We could sleep in a little bit half the Monday. And one time there was a order that I was given by CMO saying, here's a piece of paper, it says nobody's to go home tonight, but because you're not CMO, you can't tell them not to do it, but you can hand them the piece of paper. So I was handing people the piece of paper as they would come down in the elevator to go home, and they go, nah, and they go back up the elevator to continue selling stuff because they wanted to go home and sleep. But one woman did not pay attention to this order from CMO, and that actually was kind of also, I would think, a way that I started realizing I didn't have to be such a servant of everything they ordered. And I gave her the piece of paper that said, we have to meet our sales quota tonight or nobody goes home to sleep. And she looked at the paper, she laughed, and she threw it on the ground. I had to go pick it up. And that was actually Yvette Shank, the CO OSA, CO Commanding Officer, OSA Canada, who later started the application process to have me declared. But in that moment, it actually was kind of a positive experience because it was one example of, you know what, you don't actually have to do everything that you're ordered to do. And I think, and what she was thinking when she threw that piece of paper on the ground is, you know, she's also in charge of not just Enemies of Scientology, but she's in charge of promoting things like the drug-free marshals and community service activities like, well, what they think is a community service activity is protesting the APA, the American Association of Psychiatrists, or
CAPA, Canadian Association of Psychiatry.
Okay, I can't remember the acronym, but it's the American Psychiatry Association. That's it, the APA. So that she believed at that point, she conveyed to me by throwing that paper on the floor that, yeah, I know there's all this insanity about selling stuff and meeting our sales quotas, but there's actually more important things that she thinks she's doing apart from just selling stuff. And that was actually something that I would say definitely contributed to seeing things differently and to not being such a servant and maybe even starting to think for myself a little bit. So yes, I will touch a little bit on the sales focused stuff was definitely covered in Maclean's magazine as well as the Toronto Star and elsewhere, and not being able to visit my family was definitely covered, but I did find that there was not much coverage about this girl. So her name was Melissa, and I first got to know her when we had a project to sort out what's called central files. It's in the basement of the building, all these rows of folders, like maybe 80 to 100,000 folders, and there was boxes and boxes of incoming and outgoing communications to these people from 20 years ago, and it never got filed in because there were just not enough staff of the main org. So somewhere, I guess it was in preparation for the next big, sell-a-thon, where they wanted to make sure they had all the up-to-date information to maximize their chances of selling to the most people. And it was a pretty boring task, just going through these old, some of the boxes were so old that they smelled like fire because they came from the previous location. I think it was on Avenue Road where there was actually a fire. So this is some really old paperwork, and it was an ethics action on the Toronto church that the Sea Org had to come down and take over the project because they were completely, failing to keep the files up to date. So I think it was half a day I would be on course. This was back in 2007 when I was first recruited into the Sea Org. So half the day I would be studying the Sea Org stuff upstairs, and the other half of the day I'd go down and grab a box of this unfiled papers and start finding the correct folder to put them in. And Melissa was there too, along with some other people who were either recruits for the Sea Org or for CMO. And I just remember because she was probably the youngest person in the whole organization, and so I think probably 12-year-old girl, and she was just being a kid and enjoying her time and not taking life too seriously, and that kind of really struck me to see that. It was kind of a nice change as opposed to just everybody silently filing papers. She was just chatting away, so I was like, okay. And then in late 2007, early 2008, Melissa finished her, it's called the EPF, or Estates Project Force. It's like the post-recruitment period where you're just doing manual labor of sorts. And for CMO, it was like ironing executives' uniforms and mostly administrative stuff like maybe tidying up papers in various, the 3-box system. And then, I think in the middle of 2008, especially after I went to LA for the summer of 2007, and then in the early 2008, she finished EPF, and I guess I noticed changes. I noticed that even for, I guess in 2008, she would have turned 13, and she was just becoming really kind of dark, and the sort of the smiling face that she used to have was gone, and it seemed to be gone too soon. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was like this just sort of carefree, happy child was now somebody who just looked like all of the life and all of the joy had been sucked out of her. And that was kind of concerning. And I think eventually what that turned into was I realized that I was also going through that process of just being your typical, I was recruited when I was like 18 or 19, and going through that process of getting used to, this is a very serious job, and there's nothing more important, and it's just everything you do, from tying your shoelace to printing out some documents, was mission critical. And I think seeing Melissa go from just your typical average kid to somebody who clearly was not they were not as carefree and joyful as somebody who was that young should be. And I just realized that something was, some part of this training that you get in the Sea Org, it changes you, and it really changed her. And it's a shame. I don't know how she is today or where she is, but that was a real eye-opener for me, and I don't think that really got covered anywhere. So seeing her transform from just your typical kid to somebody who just, it was all here's orders, you have to convey those orders, you got to get the task done, get a product, was the saying, and it was saddening to see that.
Really?
Yeah.
There are reports of many instances in the United States where people who actively speak out against the church are followed with attempts to try and intimidate, etc. Would you say that, for the most part, since you have left, that they have left you alone?
If I had left and continued to reside in their two top places, namely Clearwater, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, there probably would have been there probably would have been some degree of interference with me trying to speak out and attending protests. But there are two fortunate things. One is, by the time I left, which was, I actually left staff, I was back home with my dad around April 2009, and then got declared March 2010. By that time, there had already been so many high-level people defecting and going public in that decade, that even if I was in Clearwater or Los Angeles, they would not have had very many resources to focus on me, because I was Sea Org, which is kind of a level above in terms of like seniority and rank, but nothing close to the high-ranking people that when they left, that the things that they had to say about what they witnessed were just shocking, and the resources would have been focused on them. But fortunately, in Canada, Scientology doesn't have that strong a hold. They don't have a lot of money. Evidence by me making, instead of the $50 a week, only like $15 a week most of the time, $12.50 some weeks. So we're not very rich in Canada and in Toronto. And the other thing that was interesting is that because I was so recently a Sea Org member, that even the people in OSA, they knew me personally and kind of liked me. So I think that it came down from high up that if we tell these people to go harass him, there's a better chance that they'll think twice, like, why did he leave? What's really going on here? So I think they thought it was safer just to keep people away from me. Just don't talk to him. because there was a chance that I would tell them, look, there's concerns, legitimate concerns that I have about the way the organization operates, and that might turn some people into, back into thinking for themselves, thinking critically, and they do not want that. So yeah, lucky to be in Toronto, Canada, and lucky to be out at a time when so many people, the spokesman for the Church of Scientology International is now the spokesman for the protest against the Church of Scientology, and it couldn't be a better time to leave Scientology with all the people speaking out. I've got a collection of like 6 or 7 books, all by former high-ranking people, published books, not just ebooks. Like, these are books that have gone to publishers and been published and sold, all from high-ranking people who've left. So by comparison, I'm chopped liver. I'm not a high target for Scientology.
Okay. In online posts, you had mentioned in the past that both your father and a cousin were still in the church. Is that still the case as far as you know?
Last piece of news I have heard, which was via Facebook back in 2012 or 2013, is my cousin Dylan, son of Peter Byrne, no longer in the Sea Org, and from what I remember, he was one of those, kids who grew up very young and so very dedicated. So probably what happened is he got what they call offloaded. He probably got kicked out of the Sea Org because they considered him a potential trouble source by being related to me. And last time I heard, he was working for Wise in Vancouver, which is where his dad Peter Byrne lives. And yeah, he's gone back to public, but no doubt in my mind he'll never speak to me, and he's just as dedicated as he was when he was in the Sea Org. They decided that it was a risk to have him around because of being connected to me by way of being a family member. So there's that, and then my dad, still have not heard anything from him at all. So I have no reason to doubt that he's still very much a dedicated member. I don't know if he is if he's allowed to do courses because of me protesting or what, but he's not reached out to me, and he knows he can reach out to me because my phone number's on the internet, and he still has my email address. So looks like he's still in.
Maybe one day.
Maybe one day, yeah. Okay, on to the next series of questions. This is the person on Ex-Scientologist message board asking a little bit about religion and philosophy in general.
Do you still believe in any of the concepts you grew up with, such as reincarnation, or have you essentially thrown out the entire belief system that you had in Scientology?
When I was out of the Sea Org in 2009, I started reading, and I don't think I was sure either way what I wanted to believe, what I didn't believe. All I knew is that something was wrong, and I remember the very first thing that I was thinking when I first went on the internet to read about the CLO Canada and why things just didn't add up, why there was so much obsession on making money and not really that much concern about helping people. So I was just like, what happened? Like, did my particular CLO, did that organization go corrupt, but everywhere else in the world, they were still trying to help people, but here they went corrupt? Like, I didn't know the scale of how bad things were. But once I did start reading and understanding what's really going on and how it's going on uniformly worldwide, is I felt really almost betrayed. And I remember reading somewhere that people who have been into not just Scientology but other types of cults and given their all to serve it, because mind control was used to make them like a servant almost, as they call it, rape of the soul. And in that respect, I feel in a way that I would never be able to trust in the way that you kind of have to trust when you're dealing with something that is spiritual or even religious in nature. So at this point, I've pretty much discarded everything that I was raised to believe. And I mean, it's been a while now, but I'm still trying to get used to the real world paradigm and to see the real world as it can be seen, and not how I was how I was twisting everything to see it differently through the rose-tinted glasses of Scientology. I still find that if I talk about it too much with anybody who, like, even now, it's possible that throughout this interview I have used a Scientology word accidentally, because when I sort of go back into that time when I was very much a dedicated member, it almost still seems to like be a part of my vocabulary. It's getting better, but when I first got out, I couldn't talk to somebody for more than 5 minutes without using a word. I would think of people as wogs, which is the term for non-Scientologists, but I'm more or less, I am separating myself from everything that I learned, and I'm getting better at not falling back into talking like a Scientologist and not thinking about things using Scientologist terms, although now and then I will still see an acronym, because Scientology is full of acronyms, thousands of them, and I will read the acronym and I will think about the Scientology term as opposed to the real world term, and so that's a little bit annoying. So I haven't gotten rid of everything. There's still a little bit there, but I am trying. I can't think of any examples right now, but yeah.
Okay. Do you presently follow any other religions?
Further to what I said, I just don't, like, I actually have changed my mind about religions, because when I was a Scientologist, the idea in the Scientology paradigm is that other religions, they were kind of getting close to an understanding of the truth about spirituality and the truth about the nature of the universe, but they didn't quite get it right, or over time, their knowledge got distorted. So I used to think of religions as failed attempts to achieve truth, but I'm trying to, again, return to the real world view and understand religions as a faith that a person has, and that there's no one right one, and that there's no reason for me to think of other religions as less than, or that I'm better than them, which is what I thought when I was in Scientology. So, but there is a bit of a trust issue, and I don't think I will ever in my life be able to have that kind of a trust in something that can't be seen concretely, because when somebody does have faith in a religion, they are putting a bit of trust, and in most cases, if it's a legitimate religion, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, then they're not being taken advantage of, they're not being manipulated, so they're giving their trust and they're getting what they're getting out of it. But I don't think I could ever do that, just because of how badly I was sort of abused or traumatized through believing so thoroughly in Scientology, and then finding out that I basically, I'd been manipulated into giving my entire life away, theoretically, for the rest of my life, in service, in working for them, thinking that I was going to get something, magical out of it, some great spiritual abilities, I guess you could say. I was going to say, from the previous question, I don't think there is another question here about that. One of the big parts about leaving my beliefs in Scientology and their theology, and the theology of this bridge to total freedom, and about rehabilitating a person's spiritual powers, which are pretty much describable as godlike powers, is that when I finally read the OT levels, all the way from OT1 to OT7, they had exact copies of, and then OT8 was there, and I think it was done by memory, assembled by memory from people who had completed OT8. And it's, to the average person, you read OT3 and the story about Xenu and volcanoes and everything about that, and it sounds really strange. But as a person such as myself, who was already a really strong believer in Scientology and how it saw the previous, the origins of the universe and the spiritual nature of man, it's not what's in OT3 that really turned me off, and it's not what's in all the other OT levels that's what turned me off. It's what's really blatantly missing. And what's blatantly missing is anything about regaining the powers. Like, if you want to read strange stories about what happened in the past millions and billions of years in Scientology's view of the world, just pick up the book A History of Man, because that's a strange book. I mean, that was strange for me. It covers a lot of weird stuff, like the reason people cry is because there's a part of our there's like this spiritual artificial intelligence called the genetic entity that in the view of Scientology, that's what keeps your heart beating, and it does spiritual stuff, so it's kind of like autopilot for us to focus on everything else in our lives, like doing our jobs and carrying on with our daily activities. So the genetic entity picked up a traumatic incident from, I think it was a mussel, where it has those two tubes that it can breathe out of, but it also eats. And there would be a tide coming in, and the water would get stuck in the mussel, and it would go down the tone scale to grief, and it would have to eject the water in order to be able to breathe again. And so that's why we tear up when we're sad. That's why we cry, is because of this past incident on our genetic entity track. So it's really weird. And honestly, you could take the whole Xenu story and put that as one little paragraph in A History of Man, and nobody would make a fuss about it. But the difference is, A History of Man is like, what, $18, $20, whereas the OT levels are like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands by the time you've done them all. So it's not what's in OT3 that was, it's not like I read the thing about Xenu and I said, oh, this is really strange, so I'm going to leave. I read much stranger things in A History of Man, but what I was expecting was a combination of self-discovery, being able to remember the whole track, which is the billions and trillions of years that I theoretically existed as a spirit, and being able to regain memories. Now, there is a saying in Scientology by L. Ron Hubbard that says, what is true for you is what you have observed yourself. And when you lose that, you have lost everything. So the other downside, the other thing about the OT3 and the Xenu story that's wrong is we're not remembering that. We're being told what to think. And that's kind of, for me, evidence of L. Ron Hubbard knowing that we're not going to remember anything. So he gave us something to remember, because there's just not going to be anything there. And the other thing too is I thought that OT levels would be about what is the definition of operating Thetan, which is cause over MEST. MEST stands for matter, energy, space, and time. So, I would actually hear people in the Sea Org now and then talk about interesting things about what they thought it would be like to be OT, and this is why they were dedicating their lives. It's like, during a session, it would be kind of nice to just, as a spirit, float out to Jupiter or Saturn or any of the planets in the solar system as a spirit and just kind of look at it, touch it, smell it. I'm sure Venus smells pretty bad, but maybe go there and smell that. Or even farther, like other galaxies, just to be able to experience the universe as a spiritual being once again. And that's what holds Scientologists into that's the carrot on the stick that keeps them going, that they really want to get to that stage. They don't just want to read about some alien that did something with people and was a bad guy, because apparently there's that I don't even think that was Incident 1. I think that the OT level was called Incident 2, and Incident 1 was down trillions of years before that, and that's not even confidential. Incident 1 was something about the very first misunderstood word, and if you know anything about Scientology, they're obsessed with making sure to avoid misunderstood words. So the Xenu story, by being so small, and yet being the entirety of OT3, and then 4, 5, 6, and I think 7 is the last one where you're wrapping up all the mess caused by Xenu, it's like, well, where's the actual good stuff? Like, where do I get to practice picking up objects telepathically? Well, telepathically is not the right word, because that means using your brain to do it. You're just, as a spirit, you're floating over there and you're picking it up, because as a spirit you should have the ability to interact with objects and to be able to create and destroy matter. I was thinking at some point in the OT levels I'd float over to some galaxy where nobody could see me and like blow up a planet there and maybe create a new one. Like, yeah, it sounds really crazy, and I'll say it again, I don't believe any of this now, but that's the kind of stuff I was thinking I would get to do and the kind of powers, you know, in some cases, in some ways, you could even say that Scientology is rehab for gods, because the eighth dynamic, just a part of your life, is what they call the God dynamic. It's not worship God, it's your job as a god during the previous trillions of years, where you were kind of, you know, one day you were a bus driver, the other day you were a postman, the day after that you were God presiding over a planet, and it was just a job. It was just one aspect of life as a spiritual being in the universe. So that for me, that for me was the biggest component of going from maybe I believe it to no, it's not something I want to believe, because there's nothing in it that even closely resembles the powers that we were told we would attain. And I think anybody who is still has that carrot on the stick, they're still, you know, a glazed-eyed believer, and they really want to get OT, to see OT3, to see that Xenu story and go like, so is that it? Like, you know, where's the rest of it? That for me is I think the number one way to get someone to realize that Scientology isn't everything that it's cracked up to be. That it's not going to give you magical recall of billions and trillions of years ago. You're not going to be able to do all those amazing things in what they call the OT success stories, where people will say, oh, this great thing happened to me, and it happened to me because I'm OT, or I just decided that I was late for work, so I decided all the traffic lights would be green, and lo and behold, they were all green on the way to work. So like, that was me using my OT powers. And my dad loves hockey, and he would tell me often that when he saw a hockey player did an amazing thing, he said, I don't know how, because they're not Scientologists, but somehow that hockey player did that amazing thing or got that goal because they somehow tapped into their OT abilities to do that. So for him and for Scientologists around the world, like, OT represents the pinnacle of your accomplishment and achievement in life, and they believe that Scientology is the only way to do that. And it's not just about reading stories about aliens or Xenu or you know, what I talked about in the book A History of Man. It's about really regaining immortality as a spiritual being, and it's going to be a disappointment, and that's why people leave when they get to the point of realizing that ain't happening. Then it's sort of game over. They're done. They don't want to be in Scientology anymore.
Okay, next question. What is your current viewpoint on organized religions?
Well, since I've never been part of what I consider a legitimate religion, I don't consider Scientology a religion. I consider it a corporation that's in possession of materials that an individual could read, and for that individual they could become religious beliefs. But I see Scientology as a corporation, and I've never been involved with organized religion, so I can't really have much of an opinion. But the only thing I would say on reflecting on this question is that you know, there's a big difference between mind control and religious beliefs, and I can see now that because my religious beliefs as a believer in Scientology were manipulated through techniques known as mind control or destructive mind control, that I would definitely say that people in religions are vulnerable to mind control, and it happens. You know, there's probably cases in every major religion where mind control was used to manipulate a person to do destructive things, either to themselves or to others. You know, mind control in Islam, you get recent stories about terrorists, cells like Al-Qaeda, and then you can get mind control in Christianity. There were some interesting things that happened, very interesting extremist Christian sects in the United States that I've read about, where they, you know, just went off the walls, and there was one, I think Waco, Texas, ended up with a shootout with the FBI. So anybody with religious beliefs, I think, is vulnerable to mind control, but I don't think it's entirely 100% correct to say that Scientology is a true religion, or to say it's 100% that religion causes mind control. They're two separate things, and the only thing I could say from my experience in Scientology is that people with religious beliefs are definitely vulnerable, and I think it's important that as a society we make sure that those vulnerabilities are not taken advantage of, and that religions are legitimate and that their purposes are legitimate, because if they go off into a direction that is self-serving, their members are more vulnerable because they're believing in something that can't be concretely shown. So that's all I can say about that.
Okay. In retrospect, what are your views on Hubbard and his intentions?
Well, what I'll answer is, since I have read a lot about Hubbard and since I've never met him, I'm going to try and answer what I thought before I started reading about him on the internet or about him in the books that I have read. I've read just about every book that's come out. And that would have been the time between when I left in 2009 and that was spring 2009, and then the summer and the fall where I started really reading on the internet. And I think that the one thing that I sort of came to an opinion about before reading about him was that there was, as far as I know, there's no policy letter. And if anyone who knows Scientology, it has volumes and volumes and volumes of books full of these policy letters on every detail of running the organization, and yet there's no policy about what the turnover would be between when Hubbard was running the church to when he was running it from a distance to when, you know, he dropped the body, so to speak. There's not a single policy, and if anybody can find such a policy on turnover of leadership, that'd be interesting to see. But it was definitely odd that there was never any policy, and assuming that it's true that there is no policy, it says something. And I'm not sure what it says. It either says that, you know, he wasn't planning that far ahead, that his main interests in Scientology were only while he was around, or maybe there was policy on turnover and somebody made it disappear because it wasn't in their interests. But there's definitely something interesting about the lack of policy on turnover. The only other thing I could possibly think is that Hubbard had a very rough and tumble idea of how the Sea Org should be run, and he maybe didn't create any policy because maybe he thought the best way for the new leader is like a survival of the fittest. Whoever fought the hardest for it would get it. I don't know. But that was definitely an odd thing because there was policy on everything else. You name it, there was a policy on it, but nothing about turning over leadership. So I don't know exactly what to draw because I only, you know, once I started reading, I started to develop new opinions, but I'm trying to answer from sort of a freshly out of Scientology point of view and not reflect what other people have read or researched. And that was probably the thing that stood out the most to me, is that, like, why is there no, like, why is there no particular rank that would be, this is the person who is in charge after I'm gone? And I know that RTC, Religious Technology Center, there's a chairman of the board there that currently is held, but that's not technically in charge of management of Scientology. That the person in charge would have been the commanding officer of the Watchdog Committee, which is basically a CMO thing that's in charge of Church of Scientology International, that's in charge of the International Liaison Office, that's in charge of the CLOs, that's in charge of the orgs. So that person is, they're gone. That was Tom DeVocht, and I was amazed because when I first met him on Facebook, I was still kind of like entrenched in the idea that these people were high-ranking and they should be respected and everything. And yeah, I mean, as far as the current policy that I have seen in the current org boards, the organization charts, and how the organization should be run internationally, it was CMO, or commanding officer or chairman of the Watchdog Committee, and that person's now, you know, they're out there. There's a hate video on Freedom Magazine saying that he was just a loser, but for someone who was in, it's like, no, he wasn't just a loser. He was kind of the one running the show. So what's going on now? So I don't know what Hubbard was planning, especially for after he had passed away. There didn't seem to be any planning there for what was going to happen, and perhaps it could be inferred that he didn't care. Once he was gone, then his purpose, you know, from what a lot of media outlets have said, is that his only purpose was to make money. So if he's gone, then he doesn't care about making money anymore. I mean, that may support that he had no policy on how to keep the organization running after he was gone. Let's see, what else? Yeah, I think that's about it on that. The other thing that was interesting is I just remembered now a story where I was in an office called External Communications, And I was actually with Dylan, my cousin, and external communications, basically shipping and receiving for documents and stuff to the Canadian organizations. And my attitude as a Sea Org member may not have been as dedicated or, you know, as valiantly, I don't know, honorable as other Sea Org members, but I saw Hubbard as just a guy who came up with something amazing. And I didn't see him as to be worshipped or as a godlike figure. I saw him as somebody who did a great thing, and I wanted to help out, but not in a way that was subservient to him, but just like almost like a partnership. He came up with it. I can continue, you know, from my job as a Sea Org member, continue what he started. But there was no sort of sense of he's a superior being or that, you know, I should worship him. But one time, me and Dylan, we were talking about something about Scientology's goodwill efforts, like the drug-free marshals, the volunteers and stuff like that. And there was something that Dylan said that I didn't really think was helping anybody. And then he said something like, well, Hubbard wanted it to be that way. And then I was like, well, Hubbard can... And he's like, what were you about to say about Hubbard, our leader, our Commodore? I was just like, whoa, man, whoa, back down here, you know? And then I told him, like, I never have seen Hubbard as somebody who is, like, superior to everybody else. I just saw him as someone who came up with the technology that could, theoretically, that he claimed could bring people to a better state of being and to enjoy life better. So that might be another reason why I was able to escape after only 2 years, whereas Dylan, his father, Peter Byrne, and my dad may never escape, as they may actually have shifted into seeing Hubbard as a kind of a deity of some sort of superhuman figure that should be worshipped, whereas I just saw him as another guy. And in some ways he does have some writings, and he does have somewhere in his lectures like this idea that he's not trying to be a god, he's just trying to be a guy who came up with this stuff. But apparently I missed the memo on worshipping him, because Dylan definitely, you know, had a much stricter, a much firmer stance that Hubbard, he didn't even let me finish saying what I was going to say, which was probably something that was rude, but at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was just use the technology to help people. I didn't come to the Sea Org to spend the rest of my life worshipping anybody. So, that's that. Next question.
While you obviously never met him, do you think his vision of Scientology is what it is today? A corporate empire, etc.?
Yeah, tough question again. Never met him. Everything that he says in his writings and the lectures, it's always accompanied by claiming that as a result of what he called expansion of Scientology would be a resultant improvement in the quality of life of everyone around the world. So if you took him at face value in what he wrote and what he said, even as a Sea Org member sort of behind the scenes, I was never exposed to any writings or orders or anything that said, yeah, that's just kind of the front end, we're actually just here to make money. Like, everything he said was always accompanied by, yes, we are going to expand, yes, it's going to be like a corporation, because he's obsessed with organizing everything. If you actually take a Church of Scientology org board, just a typical everyday, like not a Sea Org or international management, just like Church of Scientology Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal or Quebec, it's called the Class 5 org board, and it starts out with, like, you have the executive director and then division directors, and then you have departments, units, unit ICs, and people. If you actually add up, because every unit, he said, is supposed to be no more than 5 people, but if you multiply all those across all 7 or 9 divisions, because Division 6 now is 3 divisions, if you multiply all those, it's like 2,000 people. So he definitely had a very large view of how big Scientology was going to become, but he never, in any of his writings, even the stuff that only Sea Org members get to read or listen to, he never separated expansion from helping people. There was never anything like, yeah, we're actually just here to make money. And that's why I became disillusioned, because I'm like, okay, well, he never said that the focus is all about money. And there's one of the jobs that I had as an HCO staff was putting up the statistics. There's these little statistic graphs every week on Thursday after 2. We'd print out the statistics for the previous week, and they were statistic graphs from everything from products completed in each, whether your job was to run the course room and teach people, or not, you know what I mean, run the course room and have people pass their courses, or whether you're like me in shipping and receiving and the number of packages and how quickly you sent them out and stuff like that and on time. So there's statistics for everything, and one statistic that was very concerning, and you may have seen a video of me speaking at the Cambridge Ideal Org protest, was that there was a statistic which is clears, the number of clears produced in all of Canada. And it was tabulated for every org, all the way from Vancouver in the west to Quebec in the east, and it was 0. As long as I had that job from fall of 2007 to probably fall of 2008 to spring of 2009, so at least 5-6 months, there was not a single one. It was 0 every single time. And during the big push for the sales, you know, you'd have the highest ranking person, commanding officer, CMO. She'd go around yelling that we're low, we're down stat, this is out ethics. But I never saw anybody high ranking getting angry that the statistic on clears, which according to the aims of Dianetics and Scientology, that's the #1 goal. And nobody ever complained about that. Nobody ever went around yelling, hey, this is bad, we haven't gotten any clears in a year across the entire country. Nobody's gone clear. You know, it was never about that, and that really stuck in the back of my mind. That was a real departure from what I thought Scientology was about. But as far as what Hubbard wanted, he never, at least in all of the documents and lectures that I've been exposed to, he never separated. He never went down just the one road. It was always Scientology is going to expand. We're going to help people. We're going to expand more. We're going to help more people. So it's hard to tell what his actual goal was. And if he did have if he really only wanted the money, he kept it very close to himself. It was not something that even upper management was aware of. Okay.
Yeah. Do you think he was mentally ill or just had a wild imagination?
Was Hubbard mentally ill? Well, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, and he probably would never have agreed to see one for personal reasons. From what I've read, I'm pretty sure mental illness was present, but I don't think that any particular one mental illness was responsible for his, you know, coming up with this entire scheme, coming up with the name, all the technology, all the policy, all these spiritual concepts. I would sooner attribute that to his career as a science fiction writer and his fascination with science fiction. But not to say that later on in the years that certain mental illness, certainly there seems to have been some paranoia that started to color how he ran the organization. But I don't think that any one particular disorder or you know, mental illness would have resulted in him coming up with this entire thing, because it's a very vast and complex system. Everything from the policy to how the organizations are run to the theology of what a spirit is, inventing an entire new language for just about every word. Really complex thing. But I can definitely see how certain things that he was experiencing, such as paranoia, may have affected how he operated the organization after its creation, after its inception. All right, the road ahead. Last set of questions for today's interview.
Okay. Do you follow any of the current events of Scientology and the Leah Remini series, or do you try to stay away from the subject now?
Well, looking at the timeline, I have been out of the Sea Org for about 10 years, 9 years since I was declared. Actually, 8 years since I was declared, 9 years since I got out. But we're coming up on a decade now. And for me, I think that I've done a fairly good job of doing my part to share my story and to be that person who has the most recent knowledge of what's going on in Scientology management in Canada. But I also see that by escaping, I've kind of won my freedom to live the rest of my life the way that I would like to live it. And if I were to dedicate the rest of my life entirely to, educating and speaking out about Scientology, then I kind of think, well, what's the point of having escaped in the first place, right? Like, the reward for having escaped for me is I get to actually think for myself and live my own life and to follow the dreams that the Sea Org recruiters, kind of manipulated me into abandoning. So I believe that I will always be there as a potential resource. For example, my phone number is on my signature of the different Scientology forums. And, I remember, like, back when I was protesting out in Orangeville for the advanced organization St. Hill Canada, I said, my purpose is not to create hostility or contention, because these are people that are kind of victims in my eyes, and I wanted to do my best to see that the neighbors of this organization, or the neighbors of any Scientology, especially Sea Org management type organization, because it's a very isolating life, that they'd be there to help somebody if they do manage to leave, and they leave in an isolated area where it's kind of hard to just travel to somewhere to get on a public transit and go somewhere to get help. So I intend to the best of my ability to be there just in case there is some sort of an emergency where somebody does end up leaving on an urgent basis and does need help to get their life back on track. But I don't think that I will be putting I won't be putting in time every single day to speak about it or write about it, but and I think that's the right thing. I don't think it's the right thing for me to consume the rest of my life on Scientology, because I was born into it, I was raised in it, and I almost lost my entire life to being trapped within their confines. So I'm going to be there, I'm going to be on standby, but I really think that the best way to make use of having escaped and having gotten away from the mind control is to make the best of my life as I can now and into the future. As far as following things like Leah Remini's series, I probably know everything that has happened that's going to be spoken about because of all the books that I've read. I've read Amy Scobie's book, I've read Mark Headley's book, like I said, 6 or 7 books. I can't even remember the names of some of the people because I haven't associated them with YouTube videos and such.
Lawrence Wright.
Lawrence Wright, yeah, not even a Scientologist, just a journalist writing about. So I've read about so much that the Leah Remini series, or any series from now into the future, will mostly be a repeat. And for me, it's just going to be depressing. And I won't be able to move forward with my life if I keep getting depressed over hearing what happened to these people, because they didn't deserve it, and it was worse than what happened to me. That's why I'm not in that show, because I'm very fortunate that nothing too serious happened to me. It's certainly, there's a lot of things that were unfair, but I was never physically beaten, and I'm fortunate. So if the trade-off is I didn't have a really terrible time, but I don't get to be on TV, I'm going to take that deal. I don't want to have gone through what some of these former executives have gone through, because it was just awful. Some of it was just terrible. So in the interest of me getting on with my life, I kind of have to separate from it, because it's just going to kind of traumatize me over again. All right.
You wrote that it is difficult to find work. Is this because of including Scientology-related work experience on a resume, or because by excluding such, your past work experience on a resume is limited?
Well, the biggest issue, because I did actually start working as the newspapers covered. I started working before I was even declared an SP, because I knew that it was probably going to happen, as I was, reaching out and making contact with people over the internet. So I started working, and I guess my analogy for the whole experience between being offloaded from the Sea Org by intentionally not cooperating and just kind of not really being a good employee, and to getting declared and finally making it out on my own after my dad kicked me out of the house, was this. I kind of see it like the way it happens for a car accident. Like, you get into a car accident and you have just enough adrenaline to get out of the car, get yourself to safety, And then like after a while it kind of sinks in, like, oh my god, I was in a car accident. You'll often see that, I've seen it, like people sitting at the side of the road and they're just kind of in shock. They don't know what's going on. I think that was very similar to what happened for me. I had a bit of an adrenaline rush, knowing that things were going to go down, things were going to happen, I was going to have to be self-reliant, and there was kind of adrenaline there to get myself into a place where I was self-sustaining and able to work able to hold a job and be able to pay rent for even just, a single room. But after sort of things started to settle down, and I did have a regular job, I was working full time and doing well, the depression that started to sink in became heavier and heavier and heavier. And it got to the point where I couldn't work just because I was too depressed to get out of bed in the morning. And so that was back in 2011, even early 2012, that I stopped working. So for me, the biggest barrier to work is not so much about what's on my resume. It's just it's about recovery from the experience that I've been through, and kind of the culture shock of having to go back into the world and look at it for what it really is and not for how I saw it. So there's a lot of things that shook me up about realizing what I had gone through and what things really were. And if it's been a journey of recovery from depression for me, and I do have professional help, which is great. And there will eventually, hopefully, be a time where I'm able to get back into the job market. I guess the first goal for me would be to go to college or university, because I was recruited right after high school, so I never went to college or university. But if I did that, then the next step would be to find work. But for me, the main barrier is to overcome the depression that I've been facing.
Okay. Do people in your current social circles know about your involvement with Scientology, or do you tend to keep that to yourself?
You think that I would keep this to myself, but the funny thing is it was kind of backwards. When I first got out of the Sea Org, I was like, talk, and one of my first jobs was working at a pizza place up in Richmond Hill. And the next summer, after about a year of working there, there was not enough hours because summer was slow for them. So I was sort of saying my goodbyes to people there, and one of the assistant managers said, I kind of like you now, but when you first started working here, you wouldn't shut up about Scientology. So I think I'm kind of working on scaling it back a little bit. I should probably get to know people first before I tell them about that experience. Not only just for social purposes, but because it's good for me to not always be thinking about that, to try and rediscover my identity of who I am. And but eventually I think it will come out in friendships that become long term. It's just going to be one way or another. It's going to be something that ends up being talked about, and that's fine. I mean, the ironic thing is I have said more about Scientology since escaping than when I was a Scientologist, because when you're in Scientology, there's kind of this subconscious awareness that if you say you're a Scientologist, people are going to laugh at you. So it's actually easier to talk about it now that I'm out. Very strange. The other thing too is there's, as much as you hear about all of the abuses and the wrongdoing and the demanding large sums of money from their members, there still are real people. And what I mean by that is, like, I was still kind of me. I wasn't entirely, whitewashed. I wasn't entirely like a zombie. Like, I still had my personality, and other people still had their personalities, and sometimes they would come out, and every once in a while there'd be a funny story or something funny would happen. And I just remembered now something that I actually was going to say earlier about my job as a security guard is the guy I was partnered with. His name was Serge. He was a French-Canadian, older gentleman, and one night it was raining it was snowing, so this would have been the initial days of the anonymous protests in February 2008, and I think it was February, but it was definitely the time period where me and him were both doing security, and I think it reached the point probably where we both kind of realized that nothing's going to happen. Like, we're just sitting here, like, anonymous is not vandalism type people. So he just randomly got this idea. He comes out to me and he's like, you know what, Adam, there's a lot of snow building up on the roof, and I think that we better get the snow off the roof just to make sure it doesn't cause damage. And I had no idea. I don't know about buildings and how they withstand snowfall. But hey, that compared to just sitting at the front desk all night, I'm like, okay, sure. So there was actually another guy. His name was Paul. He was a staff of the Church of Scientology of Toronto. He wasn't a Sea Org member. And we gave him a walkie-talkie. Me and Serge had another walkie-talkie. We went out with snow shovels out onto the 9th floor, where the 9th floor is a smaller space than the rest of the roof. And we got out snow shovels, and we were trying to figure out how to get the snow, because it was very wet snow. And we were trying to figure out how to get the snow off the roof. And again, this is not something, I don't think that should ever be done and is not normally done, but whatever, it was just Serge's idea, so I went with it. And well, basically we're like, okay, the snow is heavy, so if we shovel it off the side of the roof, it might hit somebody. So we had Paul go out with his walkie-talkie to the corner of St. Mary Street and Yonge Street, and he would say clear, because there's nobody walking. And at first we would just kind of shove it off a little bit, and it would hit the trees, and sticks were starting to break off the trees next to the building. And he's like, oh, somebody might say something about Scientology if there's a lot of sticks falling off the trees, and they might say something's weird and go to the newspaper. So I'm like, okay. So we started throwing it a little harder, and this time the large lumps of wet snow were hitting the street unobstructed. And remember, this is 9-story fall, so when they hit, they made a loud thump, like a boom, and you could hear the echoes of all the houses all the way down St. Mary Street and off the building opposite us. And it ended up being quite fun, actually, to hear those loud thuds. And we got all the snow off the side of the building onto the street. And actually, as we were almost done, and I'm telling you, these were loud booms, like fireworks, but muffled, like boom, boom, and then you could hear the boom, 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 all the way down St. Mary's. And just as we were wrapping up, I was starting to see people, like, I could see light as people were opening their doors, because there were some residential areas, some residential or somewhat residential, but there was people must have been sleeping in these houses all the way down St. Mary's, and they were opening the doors, and I could see lights coming on. They're like, what's going on? And then the next day, the funniest part about it is I was down in Div 6, so the bottom floor. I can't even remember why. It was probably I was just starting or just wrapping up my security job for the night. And I was looking out on the street, and I saw a taxi drive down St. Mary's. And the taxi was going like a bump, 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 like those cars with the hydraulics. And the taxi driver was in there going, what's going on? Why are all these bumps? And it was, and that's just, yes, so there still are those moments of, it was just a lot of fun dealing with the actual human personality of some of the other people that again, nobody in the Sea Org went there to go, let's go rip people off for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is a great little get-rich-quick scheme. Just like me, they were all there because they thought that they were doing something good for the world, and you got to live a little. So even in the Sea Org, there's those little moments where something fun happens, and I think that Serge, by having that fun moment, I think that's just one little thing that's the part of you that helps you to escape. It's the part of you that remembers that you're a real person and that you want to enjoy your life. And that's also the part that would keep you from, like in my case, I really didn't like doing the sales because I felt that after reading a little bit about the person I was about to call, because we did have to sit down, we had to do our little duty at the telemarketing center on the 9th floor, like 20 computers with connected to, I think it was voice over IP, but yeah. I don't know the technology that they use, but it was a telemarketing center, and I'd read how the person was broke or they were having financial problems, and I'm like, well, how am I gonna feel if I call this person and convince them to give up another $3,000 for these books and CDs, right? Like, and that again was, I think, the part of you that is still human, that still cares about people and doesn't just overzealously go after the goal without thinking about the effects you're going to have on people. That's the part that helps you escape. So I think anybody who is able to hold on to that, like Serge, will eventually escape.
I believe maybe 10 years after, he probably did escape.
Well, hopefully. We'll never know. Well, unless he somehow manages to reach out to me. I'll have no idea if he did escape or not, but I hope he does. All right. That concludes the interview for today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Toronto's Root, for interviewing me. It was nice to be able to see you again, and it's nice to see that there's still the occasional YouTube video. You're keeping tabs on things, which is really nice, because there's not too many people really going the long way to keep everybody informed on what's going on. So look forward to seeing you again sometime soon, maybe at a protest.
Yeah,
And,
there's this one at Dumbass Square, I believe.
All right.
I think it's going to happen soon. The drug-free marshals thing, somewhere November or December.
Okay.
25th.
Well, we'll be in touch.
Yep.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.